On January 15, 1947, a man was driving down an empty stretch of South Norton Avenue in Los Angeles when he spotted something lying in the middle of the road. At first, he thought it was a discarded mannequin, but as he got closer, he realized it was a dead woman. He immediately reported what he'd found to the police. When they arrived on the scene, they were indeed met with the grisly sight of a naked woman's body lying in the middle of the road. She was in fairly good condition, apart from a large gash that ran across her torso. The officers who found her had no idea that she was about to become one of the most infamous murder victims in American history, known only as the Black Dahlia. For over 82 years, this case has baffled investigators. Here is the horrible story of the Black Dahlia murder. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in Medford, Massachusetts. She was described as a sensitive girl who often had a hard time fitting in. When she was just 3 years old, her father died and she became very close to her mother, who she idolized. But tragically, when Elizabeth was just 16 years old, her mother passed away from cancer. Struggling to cope with the loss, Elizabeth spent more and more time alone in her room. Her family became concerned that she was becoming withdrawn and depressed. So at the age of 18, they sent her to stay with relatives in California in the hopes that it would help her to readjust to life. Unfortunately, however, things didn't really get much better for Elizabeth. After completing high school, she went to live in Los Angeles. She took up work as a waitress, but it wasn't long before she decided that she wanted to try and make it big in Hollywood. In an attempt to fulfill her dreams, she began taking acting lessons and waiting tables at night. However, it was around this time that she met a series of bad influences who introduced her to alcohol and partying. As a result, she became increasingly unpredictable and unstable. She soon became engaged to a man named Fred Manley, but the relationship was volatile and they broke up after Elizabeth accused him of cheating on her. Soon afterward, she also had a brief fling with a gangster named Joe Sullivan. But when she discovered that he was married, she quickly ended the relationship. It was around this time that Elizabeth began using the name Jean Harrington, and while living in Los Angeles, she managed to secure bit parts in a number of films, including the 1945 film The Lady in the Lake. As 1946 rolled around, however, Elizabeth's life spiraled out of control. She fell into a deep depression and began spending all of her time drinking and partying. She was arrested several times for drunk and disorderly conduct and even got into trouble for shoplifting. By early 1947, she had no steady income and had recently been evicted from her apartment. It seems that she was staying at various hotels and trying to scrape by. Then in January, Elizabeth boarded a Greyhound bus in San Diego and traveled north to San Francisco. There is little evidence as to why she made the trip or what she planned to do there. But sadly, she never made it to her destination. As we now know, her battered body would be found 10 days later on an empty stretch of road in Los Angeles. The area where Elizabeth's body was discovered was a place where people sometimes dumped their rubbish, so it wasn't unusual for the police to receive calls about strange things being left there. But this particular call was much more serious than most. To their horror, the woman was still alive, but barely. The officers who arrived on the scene noticed that she was still breathing. They rushed her to the nearest hospital, but sadly she never regained consciousness. At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to save Elizabeth's life, but they faced an uphill battle. She had been mutilated so severely that it was clear she wouldn't make it. Sure enough, at 1:30 a.m., she was pronounced dead. After confirming that Elizabeth had been murdered, the police released a description of her killer's horrific handiwork. According to the press release, the victim had suffered from a fractured skull, 2 black eyes, a broken nose, and severe lacerations to her chest, arms, legs, and buttocks. Additionally, she had been stripped naked and disemboweled. Whoever was responsible for her death had then cut her up and removed some of her internal organs. Finally, they had placed her body back into the position that they found her in and attempted to cover it with leaves. From the moment that they received the press release, the police knew that they had to catch whoever was responsible for this crime, but they soon hit a wall. There were no witnesses, no leads, and virtually no forensic technology. They did have one lead, though. Elizabeth's dismembered body had been found in a vacant lot located near an active military base. So the police assumed that she must have been killed elsewhere and then moved to this location. To that end, they searched every inch of Elizabeth's body for clues. But unfortunately, The only thing that they came up with was a small piece of cloth that may have been part of her assailant's clothing. This was of no use, however, because it was too badly decomposed to be analyzed. As time went on, the police followed up on dozens of leads, but none of them panned out. It seemed as though the person responsible for Elizabeth's murder had literally gotten away with it. However, the press were relentless in their pursuit of the story, and they labeled Elizabeth the Black Dahlia. The media would go on to sensationalize the case, which in turn led to many false confessions and tips coming into the police. One such tip involved a man named Leslie Dillon. In the weeks following the murder, Dillon contacted the authorities and claimed that he'd witnessed the entire ordeal. According to his story, he had been driving along South Norton Avenue when he saw a couple parked in a car in a nearby vacant lot. He watched as the man got out of the vehicle and walked toward the woman, who was sitting in the passenger seat. Moments later, he heard screams, and then the man returned to his car and drove off. Dillon told the police that he'd approached the car to check on the woman inside, but she had already passed away. Thinking quickly, the police arrested Dillon and charged him with murder. However, as the trial got underway, it became obvious that Dillon was bluffing. The prosecution had no evidence to support his claims, and they were forced to drop the charges. That wasn't the end of it, though. It's just a few months later, Dillon resurfaced and confessed to the murder. Again, the police jumped on this lead, but this confession would also come to nothing. It soon became apparent that Dillon wasn't in Los Angeles when the murder occurred. Over the next few years, dozens of men confessed to the murder, but each one of them had a rock-solid alibi, and the police were once again forced to let them go. Even more frustratingly, nobody could identify the victim. Despite the fact that she had been a budding actress, hardly anyone had ever heard of her. And as the months turned into years, the case grew colder and colder. The fact that the victim had been so brutally mutilated meant that her friends and family didn't recognize her at first. It wasn't until the coroner used dental records to confirm her identity that her mother was able to say goodbye to her daughter's remains. Mrs. Short was so distraught over the way that her daughter had been killed that she devoted the rest of her life to finding her killer.
Sadly, though.
The case would remain officially unsolved until 2022, when a group of independent researchers announced that they believed they had identified the perpetrator. Using investigative genealogy, the same techniques that were used to capture the Golden State Killer, the team identified a former Red Army soldier named Joseph James D'Angelo as the prime suspect in the case. Despite the breakthrough, however, District Attorney George Gascon announced that he had no plans to reopen the case. Why? It's unclear. Perhaps the available evidence is too weak to prosecute, or maybe the statute of limitations has already expired. Regardless, this means that the horrible murder of the Black Dahlia will likely never be solved. What are your thoughts on this case? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.
Thanks for watching.